Welcome to Design and Dialogue, everyone out there. And Paula, Michael, welcome to you as well. Great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
So I take it you're both sitting in New York City in your various locations, is that right?
Well, I'm in Connecticut. And Michael, you're in...
Yeah, I'm in Westchester County.
Okay, so in near orbit of the city.
Near orbit, yeah.
Yeah, and it's great to have you here as representatives of Pentagram, the mighty design firm. And let me first say what an honor it is to have you here, and thank you on behalf of design enthusiasts everywhere for having put so much interest and beauty into the world. We are going to do something a little unusual today in that we are actually not looking at images, as is our custom at Design and Dialogue, because we thought it might be interesting to take a broader view of the condition of design now in the 21st century, and indeed changes that have happened in design over the course of your careers. So Paula, maybe I could start with you and ask a simple question, which is, what do you think the most urgent things to be talking about are right now with respect to graphic design and design in general?
Are you talking globally or personally?
Oh, let's start personally. I like that.
What my takeaway from this period of my life, working out of Salisbury, Connecticut with my team that was remotely spread all over the world, is that yes, it's possible to work with anyone, but it isn't very much fun. What's more fun is being together in a room with people and being able to make eye contact and being able to laugh and to make that form of communication and view the work itself. That the work for me that we've done, I'm very proud of actually over this period, but I find it more studied and less spontaneous by the very nature of the remoteness of the relationship. So if you're talking about what you're making, I do feel a sense of loss.
Michael, what would you say about your experience in the past year in this unconventional way of working?
I'm glad Paula went first, because actually that frames up an idea for me that hadn't occurred to me till actually you asked and I heard Paula's answer. You know, when I think about why I specifically decided to become a graphic designer as a as a high school student back in 1973 or 1974, before I even knew it had that name. The thing that appealed to me about it was that I understood that it was a way of doing art, but in a way that meant you could engage with other people while you were doing it. I was like one of those, like probably a lot of people on this call, like most of the people Glenn, I was an enthusiast, like Paula, I was an enthusiastic, I love drawing, I love painting, I love making things. But I actually had this kind of like sense that to commit to doing that as an artist with a capital A meant kind of consigning yourself to a life of solitude and loneliness, Now, whether that's true or not, there's a lot of artists I know who would dispute that, vehemently. But my image of it was that essentially you're doing something by yourself for yourself. And I used to look at, things like album covers, sort of a little bit in advance when Paula started designing them. But I remember looking at album covers of people that she ended up working with and knew, and thinking, this is like being in the, to do this cover, that's like being in the band without playing an instrument or singing, neither of which I could do. But to kind of like participate in that world somehow, and to participate in people's experience of, if you're listening to Revolver by the Beatles, you're actually engaging with the four Beatles and George Martin, the producer, and Klaus Voormann, the guy who did the artwork on the cover, right, Paula? It's Klaus Voormann, right? Yeah. So I remember thinking, boy, that's, does that have a name? What, how do you get into that particular thing? And I sort of found my way into that particular kind of thing. But because it's inherently social, as Paula was saying, it's meant to be done with other people, for other people, and it's about the outside world. And there's something just so maddening about kind of trying to practice that craft in this virtual world where all the contact you're having is like the contact we're having now, or most of it is. It just is, it's hard to do the work and to sort of think you're doing it at the best. And it's certainly hard to derive the satisfaction out of it that I, at least personally, entered into it to get access to. You know, that said, it's nice to be able to kind of work with people all over the world 24 hours a day as you can on Zoom without getting on an airplane. But it's so there's some things we're learning out of this that I suspect we'll take with us even when we come out of it. But I think boy, I can't tell you how many times I've actually been in the midst of a design discussion, you know, on screen with a group of people thinking, you know, if I could just be in a room and spread this stuff out on a table and point to this thing and say, what if we use the left half of this and combined it with the right half of that? You know, you can't do that online. You're just kind of shuffling back and forth between screen shares. It's really tough.
Well, I guess it does connect the personal experience to the global condition of design, because when you said, Michael, that when you first started out, you had to ask yourself, is there even a name for that? It almost strikes me that we're in that condition again today, because sometimes I wonder whether the term graphic design is really adequate to describe the multi-platform context in which your work is being released into the world. Or at any rate, there's been a set of transformations over the course of your careers, primarily because of digitization, that's been just so massive. And Paula, I wonder if I could ask you to talk about what your perspective is on that set series of impacts and transformations in the discipline.
Well, my design practice is very broad in that nearly 50% of my work are environmental graphics and doing public spaces. And I marry that to graphic design. And while, you know, the software is different and the thinking is different, the total approach is similar. And that in the end, you're charged with listening and making. I mean, that activity doesn't change. You're not going into a room like I do as a painter and make a thing I want to make and then put it up and hope I sell it. That doesn't exist. What exists is a different contract, a different form of business. And the business is that you have collaborators that you are your clients, who are essentially, for the most part, giving you information, having specific needs, having timetables, having budgets, and having a general prescriptive way that describes how you have to operate within those limits. And that within that, you take those boundaries and push them and move them and hopefully educate your clients and surprise them and build out these situations that become exciting, hopefully, and bring around. But it doesn't matter whether it's in 3 dimensions, whether it's completely digital, whether it's something that is a still in printed medium. It's all of these things. That's irrelevant. I am actually a believer that the act of the creation is the same and the tools can change.
Okay. And so when you think about your work being expressed in multiple physical formats and virtual formats, and the universe of, let's say, brand building or identity building, you feel like that actually doesn't fundamentally change the nature of design as you would have been practicing it back in the earlier stages of your career before those tools were available to you?
Actually, I have very many of the same problems making design for potential clients and people who are managing businesses that are growing that I do. Record cover artists. I mean, essentially they have to like it. You have the whole list of priorities. You got a big long list of stuff you got to do. It's got to be this, it's got to be that, and then you do it. But if they don't like it, they don't like it. It hasn't changed in 50 years, I have to tell you. And the one thing that I thought Zoom did, I told Michael at the beginning, I had a lot of, something's funny with the sound. Are you hearing me right? Or is this microphone on? I found that I was actually getting projects agreed to and approved faster in Zoom than I was in real life when they came for meetings. And I couldn't figure out if I was doing something better or talking more succinctly, and I figured it out. They were so happy to get off Zoom, they just said yes and got off. It actually made projects go through much smoother. Right now that's stopped, and I don't know what happened. Maybe they got used to the fact that they have to be on Zoom and they're capable of sitting there longer. But this was true, it really happened. But the engagement is the same, and it's the same with different marketing lingo over 50 years, I'd say.
Yeah.
Not the tools, not even the results, just the actual negotiated activity.
Yeah, so the human factors haven't changed, perhaps. I will say I don't think that at the end of this hour we're going to be eager to get off, but I do want to hear what Michael has to say about the question of continuity versus disruption.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about, again, about graphic design specifically as a discipline is that it really does constantly negotiate between commonly or mutually understood conventions and innovations and you know, creativity that builds on those conventions. So for instance, if you you know, Paula was talking about designing an old-fashioned vinyl, sorry, Paula, a vinyl record sleeve, a 12 by 12 inch piece of cardboard protecting a vinyl record, right? You know, those were encoded in all sorts of complicated ways, you know, and they were, from a manufacturing point of view, they had to sort of like protect the record and make sure it would get to the store and then into your home without getting broken, and you could protect it while you took it out of the sleeve and played it on your turntable and put it back in the sleeve. So it had some physical function it had to do. But at the same time, you know, if you were into music, as I was, you know, in the 60s and 70s, I would go to record stores and spend literally, you know, I could spend an hour or two just doing nothing but going through racks of these LPs. And what was really funny was you would come to understand, like, you know, sometimes it'd be bands you had heard of, like the Beatles. Sometimes there's bands you had never heard of. Sometimes there was genres you weren't familiar with, like for me, jazz or classical or things. And, you know, you realize that these things are all encoded in this way to kind of signal, you know, what's in here, you know, and the style of the photography. Does it show the band? Does it not show the band? You know, does it, you know, if it's classical, is it those, you know, a German label that has that characteristic way of framing the things, so they all sort of look the same and you can tell you're supposed to collect them all. If it's a jazz thing, is it, does it look, you know, like I remember in the 70s seeing ECM records and those, you know, Manfred Meyer things that were all like really austere, beautiful picture of like you know, a wheat field and a blue and a cloudy sky and then a little bit of Helvetica. And then you'd think, oh, obviously this is sort of like this cerebral jazz that's supposed to relax you, as opposed to things that, you know, as opposed to say Blue Note sleeves that obviously were a visualization of, came to be understood as a visualization of bebop, right? And so, you know, you can't, you know, you know, if you talk to any graphic designer who sort of like has mastered a particular genre, they'll say, I understand that, you know, if I'm designing, you know, book cover designer, if I'm designing a biography of someone, you sort of, you know, you sort of have a good reason not to put that picture, that person's picture on the front, because the person's picture on the front cover is the cue to all the people in the bookstore or the virtual bookstore, if they're kind of shopping online, that this is the story of that person's life in one way or another, right? And you could pick a classic, you know, flattering portrait, or it could be something much more surprising, and that would give you a clue about the nature of the style of the biographer. But it's all within these kind of understood conventions. And so I think what happens is new conventions as we go forward just keep getting invented all the time. So it took a while to kind of get sorted out. You know, I'm going to the website of some startup that's purporting to do something virtually that I'm used to having done, you know, in real life. And the way that that website looks, it has to not just work in a way that I'm able to kind of transact with it, but it has a signal to me, yeah, this thing is legit, but it's also somehow for me. It's not my grandfather's thing. It's some new hip way of doing things that corresponds to other hip ways I've come to do things. Sorry if I'm using language that exposes me literally as a grandfather, which I am. But I think, like, you know, as we move to these new genres, they all get encoded in these new ways. And I think that that is, in a way, the strange kind of continuity that Paul is talking about. You still, as a designer, you're kind of negotiating what those codes are. If you know, Paula, in her first book, Make It Bigger, has this great passage where she's sort of like talking about what's the language of luxury and exclusivity? What's the language of populism and democracy? If you're just buying a bar of soap, or if you're voting for a presidential candidate, I think all these things are things that, those codes are, they're there to both kind of surrender to completely, to ignore completely, or to manipulate somehow in between.
Can I ask you both, that's such an interesting idea. I'm wondering, oh, sorry, go ahead, Paula.
I just wanted to add to Michael's point. If you take something like websites, and you take almost every website that is selling something or exists as an app, it is inherently designed like Apple. And it is designed like Apple. That's been codified as the language of that. The typography is very similar. The way the white space is used is similar. The goal is to keep it simple. The goal is to make it clean. And the goal is for no other form of expression. And that this thing is pervasive, just like there was a pervasive way of designing newspapers in a particular day. Nobody's rethought that in a million years. Look at the classic papers. They essentially have a masthead on the top, pictures on front, columns of text. That things begin to own territories, and that they may be created that way initially for the technology, but the technology can change. You can overcome that. That doesn't have to be. It has much more to do with what the public accepts in relationship to the way Michael's talking about genre. Some things look a certain way, and the technology has nothing to do with that, really. Maybe at the very beginning when it's invented, but after that it stays, it becomes the norm. Very hard to break. Look at things that just are expected to be designed in a certain kind of format, in a certain kind of way. There's no rule for it at all.
And what do you think the graphic designer's role is in producing those conventions? Because I feel like we're talking at a sort of meta level here, instead of talking about a specific piece of design that a graphic designer might create. We're talking about creating the languages themselves. So what's the graphic designer's role in that?
Well, I think that it's a hard role because you have to challenge expectations. And if you're delivering a product that's based on a whole population having an expectation about what it's going to be, it's hard to change that expectation. If you start with something new and you're breaking into it and you're inventing a territory, that's actually easier to accomplish. The rate of failure is probably higher, but it's easier to accomplish. Most people have to move things gradually to make a major change in what the vernacular of major industries are. Like you even know that, like banking has become cool because there are all these sort of, extreme banks that exist online, and all of a sudden a bank logo can be a cool thing. But you would think, 30 years ago, you'd never design that. That wouldn't be any fun. I mean, think about industries, think about how they're formed, why they exist, what the goals of them are. It used to be the bank logos had to be elaborate. And I mean, before Ivan and Tom did the Chase logo, they always had serifs and they always had to look like money. That things say some of it's about technology, some of it's about perception. But right now you'll see that there are lots of things that haven't been touched when I think about general condition of website design, I don't think that vernacular has been touched in 20 years.
Fascinating. Michael.
And I think a lot of it, Glenn, is about habituation in a way. I mean, considering how much time we all spend online, whether it's on laptops or on mobile devices or something, I mean, you're not really supposed to be thinking about how you're interacting with the experience. It's supposed to almost be seemingly intuitive, and it's not really intuitive. What it is more habituated, I would say. It's like, that you press that button because every time you see a button that looks like that, that's the kind of button you're supposed to press, or a swipe, or you know what I mean? And and to a certain degree, that's what makes the world go round. I think that, designers sort of, a lot of times we are, we get this mission to be innovators and reinvent everything. But sometimes I say, hey, here's my idea. Everyone wears their underwear inside their clothes. What if we wear underwear outside our clothes? That's my big, bold idea, right? But I mean, like, why? What is the point of that? That's like an innovation that somehow is not going to work. And there's lots of, if there's graphic designers on this call, or designers of any kind, very well that people will look around and say, everything looks the same. I want to look different. And everyone does sort of want to look different, but they don't want to look too different. They don't want to look weird. And I think if they're in some sort of business, they don't want to look different in a way that would impede people from buying whatever it is they're selling, right? So I mean, I remember when in my early days at Pentagram, I had never designed a food package before. And Paula actually had some experience doing some food packaging. I had a client who actually was in some other line of business who, he was like a rich guy and I think cooked for his friends. And his friend says, "Hey, that spaghetti sauce you make is really good. You should sell that." And so he sort of started this little business, got some investors and said, "I'm going to do my own brand of spaghetti sauce." And sell it at some places in the Hamptons or to his fancy friends, right? And because I was doing some work for whatever his other deal was, his real estate business, he said, "You could do some spaghetti sauce labels, right?" And I said, "Sure." And so I started doing. I thought, spaghetti sauce labels. This is rife for innovation. I'm gonna blow people's minds and do spaghetti sauce labels that no one has ever seen before. And so I remember I did these spaghetti sauce labels that had if it was a meat label, it had an engraving of a cow. I forget, it sort of had, I have to admit, I was proud of the way they looked. They looked cool. And I remember, this is 25 years ago, Paula, so you don't remember. And I remember you looked at me and said, "These are cool. What are they?" And I said, "These are food labels for that guy I know in, in the Hamptons." And you're like, "But what's the product?" And I said, "It's spaghetti sauce." And you just said, "That doesn't look like spaghetti sauce to me. I'm not sure I'd buy that." And then I realized that it's not like this was going to be accompanied with a huge ad campaign saying, "Attention world, now hear this. Everything you know about spaghetti sauce is wrong." And in fact, if you're putting stuff on your spaghetti, it's not like you're thinking, "I'm just so damn sick of spaghetti sauce." You want spaghetti sauce, but you want really good spaghetti sauce. And maybe it's organic, or maybe it's got some special ingredients that make it ever so much more. So maybe as opposed to being Italian, it's Croatian, and that's kind of the thing, whatever that means. But instead, I've done these packages and made them look more like someone looking at this thing would look at the package and think, "Interesting. I don't think I'm going to put this in my mouth. Never mind on my spaghetti." It just was I need to buy something that I can serve to people and not worry about what is going to happen when they swallow it. And I was not providing that degree of comfort. And that degree of comfort is communicated by adhering to conventions, basically. And if you go in oblivious to the conventions, every once in a while you can reinvent something and it really works. But depending on what all my education after I graduated from design school was very little to do with design and everything to do with understanding human nature and how people make decisions, whether it's my clients or their customers or whoever it is.
Okay. That spaghetti sauce example is so powerful that I have a feeling it's going to now enter the lexicon of design pedagogy. But maybe I could bring it back to you, Paula, and ask the obvious counter question, which is about avant-gardism and the rich tradition of avant-gardism being handed down to us from modernism. And you in particular, I think, have been often understood as an interpreter or theorist, even visual theorist, of the legacies of Dada, of other kinds of radical design languages of the 20th century. So within this kind of parametric account that Michael's just described, where do you make space for avant-gardism, or is that not the right word for it?
I think you're talking about historic styles from specific periods, like Dada, like constructivism, like those sorts of really powerful inventions at the beginning of the 20th century. And that, I've used them as tools for style as a tool, and that I'm working with it to convey spirit. I use a lot of, we just did a public theater poster for the Shakespeare in the Park is coming back into the park. And the thing is really based on Dada. I redrew the front so it has sort of skinny forms with thick forms, and there was mistakeism in it and all kinds of stuff like that. And there are particular areas of design I can accomplish where I have a relationship with the client that allows me to experiment. And that form of experimentation generally is drawn on influences from all forms of things that get thrown into some kind of big mixing bowl together and come out the way whatever they come out. Sometimes they're big failures, sometimes they're things that are more inventive. For me, that type of practice is very important. And I have certain clients and projects that enable that. And when I get them, they're great. You know, and I just do them. And it's because the nature of the client is such that they expect that from me. But it isn't to make a statement that has any more impact than maybe elevating an expectation. That I think that in my, I don't remember this package Michael did, but in listening to him, that would probably be great now. You know, that because the expectation of food packaging between 30 years ago and now is really, really risen. And so that when you do these small interventions, these small experiments, you hit a level of raising public's perception of what the possibility is for these things. And they keep going up and up and up. And I will tell you, because I brought up the public theater, which I've been working for them for now, I'm on my 28th season. And initially, I didn't show that work to any commercial client that came into Pentagram because I thought it would be too scary for them. And so if I was talking to a retail facility, they would tend, everybody likes to look at Shake Shack, but nobody wanted to look at the public theater. You know, it can be these sort of, it pushed it too far at one point. Now it's like completely known centrally as what theater can look like. And that's really the goal, because now, I don't know if that's going to become banking, but the goal of design, I think, is to incrementally, because I don't think you do these things dramatically. It's not the same as fine art, and you're dealing with sort of mass approval, but to incrementally as you go, so that if you look at food packaging 30 years ago and food packaging now, you realize that the level of expectation of what is good and what can happen has really risen, and that's the victory of it. And it's a communal experience. We all play into it together by what we make. And when we can't push something, we fail.
And Glenn, if I could add something to that, when Paula's talking about like really style as a tool, right? And it is really true. And I think to an amazing degree, again, graphic designers can use that, I think, much more with more ease than a lot of our, than say architects can, or fashion designers. I mean, maybe I'm overstating that, but it seems like we're able to partake of so many different styles and switch in and out of them. And I think to a certain degree, what's interesting is that, particularly if you have a known quantity like Shakespeare in the Park, which Paul has been doing for more than a quarter of a century, almost the expectation with that is, how will they surprise, people understand the basic proposition in New York, but how will the presentation of it surprised me this time? And it's very similar to a director for the public theater deciding how they're going to stage Julius Caesar, a Shakespeare play that's been done thousands and thousands of times, and you can do it in Roman dress, or you can do it in fascist Germany, or you can do it so it feels like it's Donald Trump's cabinet. You can do it a lot of different ways. And, our mutual understanding of what that story is, the power of Shakespeare's language and, the resilience of that basic plot are such that, you can make it surprising and new by staging in another way that makes it feel relevant. I think graphic designers can do that same thing. When Paul was talking about, how style can be overlaid on things. A couple of years ago, I worked on the redesign of Poetry magazine, which is the longest running poetry publication in the world, one of the longest running publications in the world, period. And I remember we had a bunch of, it could be a lot of different things. It's basically it's just poetry. It's sort of like, so there's very little, the layouts are the poems, so there's not much you can do with that. And sort of like, how do we approach this just from a tone of voice point of view? And we had a bunch of different approaches. And I remember saying, why don't we do the opposite? Just do one just for fun. That's exactly the absolutely wrong thing you could do. And so I decided that the absolutely wrong thing you would do with poetry was just set it entirely in Helvetica, black and white, flush left, rag right, try to drain every bit of everything out of it and just pretend that we were in Ulm, Germany in 1970 and do it just pure Helvetica on a grid in for international style. And so I remember that was option number 6. And I saw it when I saw it laid out, I like literally laughed out loud. It just seemed like literally funny to me. And I said, let's show this just for fun. If anything, it'll get a laugh out of everyone. And I swear to God, when people kept when I showed it to the client, they literally went, and it made it, I believe, like it was like it made it through the first 2 rounds at least. It was, it almost was the thing they went with, because there was just something about it. The poems are the poems. You can read those poems, and in a way, let's get out of the way of the poetry and just let poetry be poetry. Sure, it can be in Helvetica. Why not? So it was actually quite, that in the end, that wasn't what we did, but it led actually in an interesting way to what we ended up doing. But it was just sort of like, it was just that delight you take in, I think designers sort of have to make the unfamiliar feel familiar. That's why startups sort of will say, I want to look like, I want to look like Harry's, or I want to look like Allbirds, or I want to look like some successful startup that kind of, got funded at some nice, interesting amount. And then familiar things want to look surprising. And that's why an old brand will come and say, how can you make people give us a second look?
Yeah. It's fascinating to think of design in these terms as a relational discipline. Like you're almost always working into a prepared ground, and there's something in the audience's head that is there unshakably, and you have to address it and be in dialogue with it, if only implicitly. I guess that prompts a question for me, which maybe I could direct to Paula, about this rising tide of expectations that you were talking about with regard to spaghetti sauce and everything else, and whether, to go back to the first question I asked, whether that is a major transformation that's happened as far as design goes, because the audience now is so different from the audience that existed, let's say, in the 1970s. It's more global, obviously, and I dare I even use the word more sophisticated, maybe, in its understanding of design. So what would you say to that proposition?
I think that we've moved from a verbal culture, at least in the States, to a visual one completely. And that explains the explosion in bespoke typography, because clients or people can recognize fonts the way they recognize logos. And that's absolutely huge. And it's fostered the kind of explosion of innovation. I think it's the best period for typography in my life. The software's there, you can program it, the ability to customize, to redraw, to invent is incredible. It's just incredible. And the game keeps getting higher and higher. It becomes more and more expected and hoped for. And I think that this is fantastic, because designers did this. There were some really bad periods of typography, I'd say, in the 90s with photo typositor and forms that were really not well drawn, and where the craft separated from the creation of it. And then it came back together when the software got better. And I would say it started to grow about, I would say, 2005 to 2010, it was starting to grow, but in the past decade, it's amazing and getting better every day.
Huh. So sorry, Paula, that's super interesting to me as a historian. Are you saying there was a kind of gulf between the age of hand-set typography, hand-drawn typography, and the sophistication of the tools, and there was a kind of break there? That's fascinating. Uh-huh.
When I started in the industry, we worked with a company called Haber Typography that had the most beautiful drawn historic fonts, both wood fonts and handset type. I still have the book to look at to remind me how beautifully those things were drawn. And that what the age of photo typographer did, it was just a camera blowing things up and down, and they weren't corrected for the height and size they were, the way original typography was crafted. So it was a weak period. Then people started doing crazy stuff with Xerox machines, like distorting things and blowing them around. And some of that was fun, but it was really, it was goofy. When the craft came back and the designer became also the craftsman, because they were separated. You went to the typesetter, they set the type, and then the designer figured out how to use and work with it. It was that relationship. Now it's one and the same. And that becomes.
Yeah, and one interesting thing, Glenn, that kind of builds on what Paula was saying, was that there was, everything got completely democratized during that process too. And it's very hard. I even have trouble imagining. I can imagine a young person today, it seems inconceivable. But when I started, when Paula started, Haber typography, like people didn't know that place existed. No one knew where typefaces came from. Certainly no one knew what they were called. If you got a magazine, if you subscribed to a magazine, it would arrive in the mail, and the processes by which that magazine was produced for most people was like this. It was inconceivable. You'd have like no, you would, you might have you might be an amateur photographer and take snapshots, but you certainly wouldn't call yourself a photographer. And you wouldn't, and like, the idea that you would have a hand in causing, a manuscript that was written on a typewriter to turn into a typeface with a name, whether it's Helvetica or Garamond or Century or Saban or whatever it was, that sort of was completely outside, not only outside the realm of imagination for people, but sort of not of any interest to them. Like, why would they care about that? It's sort of like, the car gets them where they want to go, and there's something called internal combustion, and we don't really need to think about that much, right? And what's happened since then is, so in those days, all of that stuff had a kind of inherent in authority, right? There were great photographers, there were great publishers who could really set the trends. And if something came from Condé Nast or something came from Time of Life, it actually had real weight. It set the agenda for, this is what we should be caring about. This is news, this is style. And now, anyone with a following on Instagram is making a bid to play in that same pool, and can do it with, nearly the same level of skill. And if they've got a strong point of view, they often will bring something that these large entities can no longer muster a strong point of view, because that's been institutionalized out of what they do.
So are you implying that for professional designers like yourselves, there's almost like an arms race of staying ahead of the public and its capabilities, or?
That's a way.
Yeah, no, I don't know. I think that's a losing. I mean, I understand what Paula said. I mean, I think that's, if you think that way, you're sort of setting yourself up to lose. I mean, it's, if I open Instagram every morning and just saw it all as my competition, I would give up, because I lose every day. I mean, like, you can't keep up with the imagination and surprise that you'll see coming from both professional colleagues and, I mean, it can be coming from anyone. It can be someone found some great archival thing, scanned it and posted it, and it's like, oh my God, that thing from the 40s is amazing. It could be someone who's in design school in Amsterdam or Beijing, who posts a project, and it's sort of like, oh my God, that's amazing, and I mean, I think it's great, actually. And my only ambition is, like, every once in a while to contribute something to that conversation. But the idea that anyone can dominate it anymore is actually, it's a hard goal to set for yourself. And all you can do is do your work as best you can and hope that the wheel turns your way every now and then.
Although there's, and this actually reminds me of something you said earlier, Paula, which is about educating the client, which is a phrase that really jumped out to me. And it strikes me that one big difference between what you and your colleagues at Pentagram do and what, let's say, the everyday graphic designer who's looking after their own affairs will do is that you have a serial encounter with many different kinds of clients and need to deliver what they need in an extremely nuanced and specific and bespoke way. And maybe that's still a distinguishing feature of what the professional graphic designer is doing, as opposed to this vernacular activity. And Paula, I'd love to know what you think of that idea, but also what you meant when you said educating the client. What does that entail?
Well, I think your job the client how to see. And I have an echo. I don't know how to get rid of it. Can somebody help me? Because it's actually hurting my ability to answer. Is there something?
I wonder if you just
somebody's?
turn down if you turn down the volume on your computer.
That's possible. But well, how's this? Is this working? Can you hear me? Okay. Clients know what they like. They have sort of preconceived notions when they look at something based on the area they're generalizing, not all of them. But that they'll something new, explain to them why it's working visually. Generally, what doesn't like is the extremity of something. Like something is too tall, something is too wide, something is too fat, the color is too bright, the color is too pale. You'll notice they'll always use the word too, which means there's something that's extreme. The extremity of even if it's Michael's notion about poetry magazine and doing the Helvetica, that's extreme. The extremity of the design is something good. And that very often passing over the very thing that's good because it makes you comfortable. So the notion is try to get the move progressively towards that vision. Sometimes you can't, but when you can, it's really great. And that it has to do with the kind of dialogue you have. Now, Pentagram, we're a broad partnership and people behave very differently. I never, as a woman, was capable of really selling anything. I mean, I always just had a hard time being believed because I'm a woman and I'm short. And when I was young, it was even harder. But I'm a teacher and I've been teaching for years and I know how to explain something to somebody so they can see it. And that's how I've managed my practice. And I've begun to understand how other people see. And Michael taught me a lot about it when he, this thing with his packaging project in 1994. He did a packaging project and it had two typefaces on two different styles. And one was in Times Roman, and the other one was in Futura. And the first one said, this is Times Roman, this is the typeface that has the little feet. And I thought that was really funny. I thought, why wouldn't they know that that's a serif font? They never even heard the word serif. Why would they know that? I mean, it taught me everything I learned about design since from that moment when I realized how you had to explain it. You have to understand somebody else's understanding. And the more extreme you become, the more you have to get them there in terms of what language can be. Now if you walk into a client who lives in a digital landscape and is exposed to many more things, they'll be open to different kinds of logos and the way things move and icons and wonderful things that are a lot of fun and still make a website that looks like Apple. And so that you find that there's the moment where they're not moving. And that's because they think that's how that works. And it's very hard to break that. That's the stuff that is rough. Can you make a newspaper that looks like an Apple site, and can you make an Apple site that looks like a newspaper? And can we change the expectations of what something can be? How much can you throw it upside down? When is it appropriate, and when is it really a disaster? That's the other side of it.
It's so fascinating to think that pushing against the tide of expectation, which is such an important theme in what we've been talking about, can also have to do with simply transposing one domain of design to another, and that can feel like radicalism. Just taking something there.
That's what Michael was talking about. That's what he was doing.
Exactly. Well, we only have 15 minutes left, shockingly. It goes so quickly. And I wonder if we might turn to some questions from the audience because we have many of them and they're great. What I might do is start with a question from Mohammed Rahman, who asks, how you think of communication design from an equitable global perspective, considering the emerging voices of decolonization and design and neoliberal counterparts of design capital? That's a big question, but I think it introduces a welcome note of maybe the political context in which design happens. And obviously, you know, for goodness sakes, Michael, you designed the logo for the Hillary Clinton campaign, so politics is not unknown to you. And I wonder how you both are thinking about that question, both as individual practitioners and also as partners at Pentagram.
I mean, Paul, I can take a shot at this if you want. I mean, I think that, yeah, I mean, it's something we're thinking about all the time. And I think Pentagram was a firm. Hey, Paula, can you mute for a second? There we go. I think if you think about Pentagram was founded in 1972 by 5 white guys, right? And so it's been a long journey to the firm that we have now, which still has plenty, you know, no shortage of white guys like me in it, but 24 partners and you know, 2 Asian, 2 Southeast Asian, 1 Black, you know. So I think there's you know, many more women, a more of a mix of the people, and that's something that will just inevitably increase as time goes on. So that'll continue changing. So we're conscious of that in the way we're thinking about what Pentagram is. I think overall, though, it, you know, I mean, I think that people's attempts, a lot of the decolonization of design, you know, part of it when I've been talking to educators has to do with how we, you know, how design history has been traditionally taught. And that also relates, I mean, Glenn, you're as a museum person, as a curator, you're well aware of, you know, the same sort of pedagogy that happens in the way that art history is taught, and the way that art is displayed in encyclopedic museums, right? Where it's comfortable to think that there's this kind of like steady progression, you know, that has these moments like the Bauhaus that are transformative, and then you realize that there are, you know, parallel developments happening all over the world at the same time that haven't been part of the curriculum, that actually have things that are interesting, that things could tell us, you know, the whole history of, you know, of design in Asia or in Africa or in the Middle East are all things that were happening alongside the design that was based on Western alphabets and Western languages, right? So I think, you know, at a moment where, you know, forums like this one with, you know, upwards of 450 people dialing in from around the world are all kind of partaking of the same conversation, I think, again, there's a sort of inevitability to the fact that, you know, what constitutes sort of the design canon is going to get progressively more and more destabilized, right? And I think it's just incumbent on anyone trying to work today to be conscious of that, to kind of, I mean, I personally try to approach it with a bit of, you know, with humility, and like not assume that, you know, that things in my experience kind of uniquely qualify me to dictate how every single situation should proceed. So there are certain things where I do feel like it's my responsibility to so dictate, but other times, no, you know, so it definitely goes back and forth.
Yeah, and I can just say from our perspective running this program, Design and Dialogue, my co-host Stephen Burks and I have been very, very, you know, very much directing our attentions in that way. Paula, do you want to add anything on this point?
Well, I'm optimistic always, because the one thing I found true about design, not economic opportunity, but the act of designing and making things, is that people see collectively. And if something enters the marketplace that's intriguing, innovative, and amazing, regardless of where it's from, it's going to have an impact. And that it's easier to be seen now. And that's fantastic, because that gives us a much broader language. You learn, I mean, I know that a certain amount of the way I'm looking at typography very much comes from Indian scripts and interesting things that have come out of the Far East that I've seen, and things that I've incorporated into the work consciously and subconsciously, because there's more of that vocabulary available for me to see, and it's turning up in organizations, it turns up online, it turns up on some crazy ad I saw published someplace, and just think, ooh, that's a nice way of looking at it. You know, I mean, that we impact each other. So that part of it is wonderful. And for me as a designer, I know that in the very early parts of my career, I did dumb things like enter record covers into design competitions and won awards, and that the work was seen, and it could be seen even though I was outside the group of much more powerful men. And being on an outsider in that situation, that everybody's work has power, and it's a great answer for us, and that if you disinclude based on it, you lose the connection to more creativity. So that's insane.
Yeah, well put, well put. Okay, another question. This is getting more into nuts and bolts territory, and I'm sort of taking it as a question about the iceberg-like structure of Pentagram. So it's from Pablo Londero, who asked, on the surface, Pentagram shows marvelous projects, but in the backstage, how do you manage those projects in terms of creative control, time, and resources to get to it? Probably hard to summarize, but anything you'd like to say about the structure and strategy of the firm as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, hey, if Paul, if you mute, I don't hear that echo. Perfect. The answer is pretty simple, because Pentagram has tried to set it up in a simple way. It's owned and run by designers who I don't think, you know, are that good at math or that interested in managing complicated organizations. We all just show up and want to do our work. And so Paul and I are 2 of 10 partners in the New York office. There are 24 partners around the world. Each one of those partners is a practicing creative person who shows up every day hoping to do creative work. They assemble a team around them that kind of, you know, works with them to achieve that work. And each one of those teams kind of operates as a autonomous unit that tries to replicate the most simple form of doing design as it's been done for a long time. You know, like the small atelier where everyone kind of is conscious of what the goal is, what the work is on the table. And you sort of multiply it by 10 and then by 24 and then by 50 years, which is how long Pentagram has been around, just about. And it starts to add up to something that feels substantial and starts to feel like a gargantuan iceberg, and can feel sort of like a gargantuan, you know, free floating iceberg to me and Paula and our partners at the same time. But still at the base of it is this very familiar thing. And I'm always struck, as I think Paula said towards the beginning of this conversation, I mean, the way what I come into work hoping to do every day, and the way I do that work is kind of frighteningly similar to the way I felt about what I wanted to do with my life when I was in my early 20s. You know, it's there's more complicated things to manage now, but at the end of the day, you just are turning around a problem in your mind, putting things down in the notebook, and just waiting for something, you know, looking for something that seems like like exactly the right kind of inevitable surprise that every good design is, you know.
So that's very compatible with what Paula said earlier about the continuity over the course of your careers, despite all these new tools and contexts. Just a couple more questions I guess we have time for. One is about, this is a question from Ananya Kaitan, who asks, in this age of democratization of design and design tools, how does one hold the fort for expertise without finding oneself in the territory of gatekeeperism? Really interesting idea. And I guess maybe there's a question behind that question, which is, do you think expertise is worth defending? Is that a value that you would want to uphold? Oh, Paula, you're still on mute.
Right. There we go. It's hard to define what you mean by expertise. I think you're talking about influence and power, which is different from expertise. You could have no influence and no power and still be really rather expert. I'm married to somebody like that. He actually has a lot of influence, but doesn't exert it, and works in a room and makes stuff by himself. And you know, it isn't that public facing. I think this really goes back to a lot of what Michael was describing before. Pentagram is an organization of makers. We figured out all the smart ways to try to persuade people to do what we're making, but in the end, you're an organization of makers, and that I think the act of making is inherently inclusive. I'm optimistic about that way. I think it has all change in social orders are slow, and that's not to say that's right. But the thing I've seen about design is that continually, year by year by year, the field does get more diverse. I mean, I was the only woman partner in 1991, and now there's 6. That's not huge, but that's huge at Pentagram, when there were only male partners from the very beginning of it. And that the amount of diversity in our office, except for in the area of African Americans, where we have a small percentage of students graduating, it's really a very diverse office, but not by design, by best people to hire. You know, like you can be more conscious about it, and you can specifically look for it. But I don't think you have to, I don't think it's a stumbling block, because makers have very shared visions about what they want to be doing with their time. And that's really important. I mean, there's like a symbiosis. I mean, if I look at all of my partners, that's what we have in common. Otherwise, there's nothing. You know, like, we're very diverse. It's very strange. People come from different countries. The British guys are really weird, you know, to me. And there's this bond because of what we do.
Okay, we only have a couple of minutes left, so I'm just going to ask one last question. And quite a few people have asked versions of this question, and I think I would have done it myself, which is, where are we going next? And really coming out of the pandemic and all of the shifts in so many of the sectors in which you've been, you know, collaborating for all these years, what are you seeing coming around the corner? And you know, maybe what are you worried about, but also what are you hopeful about coming next? Paula, do you want to go ahead and start on that one?
What am I worried about? I'm optimistic that the economies will come back, that the plans our government are making are going to help equalize the economic inequality of the nation to a different degree. We haven't just had a pandemic in the United States. We had a disastrous presidency that we have to overcome. So there's a lot more than design to hope for. You want to hope for just a better society. And I think that I'm looking for those projects and being together with a team that can be exciting, inspiring, good for society, all of those things. Mostly they are. Maybe they'll get better.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Glenn, I'd add to that. I like that theme of optimism. And I would say, you know, it's really weird. I think we've had a year of experimenting. What if we all communicated basically, you know, through virtual means, right? And I think we made a lot of discoveries, and I think it actually has made us better at doing that, and sort of made platforms like different social media platforms, you know, kind of like, you know, they've really turned into these deliriously fun, forums for experimentation. And I think that's going to continue. That won't go away. That is something we're going to take with us as we come out of it. But what's really interesting is, even as I'm looking right now at the screen that's in front of me, and you guys are all doing exactly the same thing, I've got it in that mode where everyone's square is the same size, and me and Glenn and Paul are just the first 3 of currently 435 of these if I scroll through all of them. And when I look at your backgrounds, I see books, I see framed art, I see posters, I see stuff. And I think what's really interesting is that this virtual world will continue to coexist with all that stuff, and how that stuff is so precious to us, so important to us, whether it's a book that we want to hold in our hands, or, you know, an image that we want to have on the wall that kind of comforts us and gives us a sense of place. All those things are really meaningful. And those are all things that designers have made since time immemorial. AIGA, our professional organization, that was founded by a bunch of guys, but guys who basically made books, like physical books, right? It was a book designing club at the beginning, right? And look at how many books I can count just on the screen in front of me right now, And so I think that world isn't going away either, and may be more important than ever at the same time. So I think the optimism is that it isn't that there's this moment of constraint or funneling down to design being one thing, but this other moment of opening up where design can be all kinds of things and ultimately everything.
What a fantastic place to end it. Oh, Paula, one last thing, but you're on mute again.
Other person doing, okay. So one thing I just want to kind of state that seems to be a general question that comes up, and this is sort of related to, is that after this year of being remote, does that prove that the remoteness is essentially right, or that's going to be a continuing thing, et cetera? And my view is people who like to sit at home and do their work will sit at home and do their work. And people that like to get up and go to someplace else and work with a lot of people will do that. And we did that before, we'll do it after, and I think it'll be fine.
Brilliant. That's an even better note to leave it on, and a rarely heard one these days. That was wonderful, guys. Thank you so much. Could have done that all day, but that was one of the most beautiful hours I can remember having in a long time. Next week, we will have Paul Briggs, the wonderful Boston-based ceramic artist, who's actually dealing with a lot of issues about diversity and agency and power in his own work. So that'll be a nice segue from today's conversation. Thanks everyone out there who joined for this conversation. So many of you from all over the world, really an honor to have you here to listen. As Lucy said at the beginning, the whole conversation will be posted on Friedman Benda's website later today so people can listen again. And it only leaves me to once again thank Paula Scher and Michael Bierut. Thanks so much for coming on Design and Dialogue, and up with stuff.
Thanks everyone, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.